Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. Here We Are, A Chronicle of Racism is a documentary by Jeffrey Robinson, an attorney, ACLU representative, who over the course of maybe an hour and 40 minutes or so uses the documentary to discuss the history of racism, right? Not just individual racism, which is what tends to quite often be focused on, but rather the history of institutional racism. This systemized white supremacy that was really built at the founding of the country, even before independence, going back to the 1600s in the colonies with the arrival of the first enslaved Africans up to the present. And so this documentary not only does it discuss history, specifically Black history, but I like books, documentaries, and whatnot that dive into history, discuss moments and events, people that we might be familiar with or think we're familiar with, but that go deeper and explore some of the lesser known aspects, especially with regards to like hidden history. There's a saying that history tends to be written by the victors, where the people who prove victorious in battle, the telling of history tends to be told from their perspective. And so with that, you then tend to have like rationalization of their actions. They're painted in the best light. Quite often in history, while it might be two groups of more in a confrontation or dealing with a situation, often one side is portrayed as being the hero and the other side the villain. Or you might have the hero and the victim, or the villain and the victim, or some combination of those things, right? Where the person who's portrayed as the victim versus the villain varies based on who's telling the story. Especially once you get years or decades past the event, where the people who might have been present, who might have been able to offer firsthand testimony, might no longer be around. You know, whether that's like written history, oral history that's passed down, because increasingly the record of it becomes important, right? Where you might have 2 or 3 different perspectives, but you're really only hearing the story from that one person. If that person has some sort of motivation to portray themselves in a certain light, through their self-interest, they might go out of their way to kind of cast away the negative aspects, the parts that don't make them look so good. And so it's like, even with regard to with history that's passed along, when you only have one person telling the story, you might come to rely on that one version, right? And so that's what the documentary explores here. I like that they don't go back and revise history, but rather revisit history. They give you a nuanced perspective, especially with regards to when you consider that, you know, perspective on events and even people can be skewed by who's telling the story. And so I like that they give a different perspective, not necessarily, you know, from the status quo perspective, where there's a difference between the perspective of the victim versus the victor. And it's like, especially with regards to slavery, with regards to racism, and all of these other incidents from history, so often in telling this history, there's a definite bias, there's a definite agenda. So it's refreshing to get a more balanced perspective that isn't pushing an agenda, you know, that's giving a more diverse perspective on these events from history. And so with that, you have where Robinson goes back to like the colonial days, when the first enslaved Africans arrived in America, and working through that period, working through slavery, Reconstruction, up into the present, the war on drugs, and even more recent events within the last few years. And so he really examines the telling of history, right? The history of Black people in America. The documentary clocks in at just a little bit under 2 hours, so it isn't enough time to get deep into every event from Black American history. But because the documentary is more condensed, it really just hits key points and does an amazing job at it. So it's like there's this exploration of how the system of oppression of Black people developed alongside this hierarchical system based on race. And not just because quite often when we speak about racism or when racism is examined, it's from the perspective of individual racism. So one person holding prejudiced views. But it's pointed out here, the problem within America is that the very society of America is based on racism. It's based on this system of white supremacy. And so Robinson does a really great job diving into not just the social structure, but the economic basis, the legal basis, and all of these other facets of American history, of American society that have Robinson does a really great job diving into not just the social structure, but the economic basis, the legal basis, and all of these other facets of American society that have been heavily influenced by this concept of white supremacy. Where when we think of slavery, number one, we think of this thing that's far removed from us, when really it's just about like 150 or so years in the past. Right? We look at it as something in the past, that slavery ended and that was the end of that. But it should give us pause, and it should let us know that that can't quite be the case, right? It's not that simple. It's not that cut and dry. Because yes, slavery ended, and it's something you hear people point to dismissively when we talk about race relations and problems within American society, where they'll flippantly say, oh, slavery ended so long ago, basically get over it. But the reality is that while slavery might have ended 150 or so years ago, the ramifications of the system of slavery continued past its official end. Because then you then have the need about 100 years later for like this mass civil rights movement. And so, okay, fine. Slavery ended in the 1860s? But you then had the civil rights movement, you had Jim Crow, you had inequalities, segregation, and whatnot that persisted into the 60s. So, no, you can't just get over it and move past it. You still have instances of situations where it becomes apparent that American society still is not equal. Ingrained within the society, within the structure of society, is this anti-Black bias, evidenced by continued economic disparities, disparities within the justice system. All of these other factors and facets of society where disparities still exist should point to the reality that the problems, the issue of racism did not end with slavery. Right, did not end with the civil rights movement. The problems that started back during slavery, that started with the establishment of slavery, continues to affect Black people in the present. And the documentary does a really great job of diving into specific examples that illustrate this reality. Like going back to colonial times, the establishment of slave society, of how slavery was going to exist, the definition of who would and would not be considered slaves. So this thing of it being based on the concept of race, right? Let's say African versus European. Christians were, even those who were converted to Christianity, because at one point Christians were Christian, right? Was the term was used. This thing of it being based on really the creation of the concept of race, right? Black versus white, or let's say those of African descent versus those of European descent. At one point, the term Christian was used in place of like white, right? And it was like an identifying term for white people, right, for Europeans. But as Robinson points out, as Africans or enslaved people of African descent were then converted to Christianity, it came into practice, right, that Christianity was no longer the dividing factor between the two groups. So it became important to denote the words. The religious beliefs or leanings were not enough to define one's state of free versus bondage. And so Christians theoretically were not supposed to enslave Christians, right? And so it's like enslaved people of African descent who practiced Christianity, there needed to be some workaround to allow them to still be enslaved. And so this is where like the physical characteristics that are used to characterize, right, where you could have the visual of light skin with freckles, right? But you might still be Black, might still be considered Black. And so it's like with Black and white people living in close proximity, and with white people being put in a position of power, authority, and dominion over Black people, you then have where it's not surprising, within this acts of power and aggression that rape would take place. The furtherance of white people's right to domination and superiority, that white men will then rape and otherwise abuse black women. And the result of that would unfold. The situation itself is unfortunate, but the result of those rapes would be children who bear the physical appearance of some combination of their parents, right? So it's like, over time, over generations, and this continued raping of black women, you might have a woman whose mother was raped by a white man, and she now is then raped by a white man herself. And so over generations, you might have children who come out looking pretty much white. And so it becomes necessary to address the physical occurrence, where it's not just enough for an individual to have light or white skin or light or different colored eyes or a certain texture of hair, because recognizing that black women are being raped by white men and that the children might come out looking more white than black, or at least racially ambiguous, it then became important to further define to ensure those children would be classified as black. And so with that, you then have this introduction of this legal statute, this legal understanding that the condition of the child is not predicated based on the status of the father, but rather the status of the mother. Because it's a way of ensuring that as white men continue to rape black women, that any resulting offspring, instead of being automatically granted freedom, as they might have been if their status was based on that of their father, basing it on whether or not their mother is held in bondage ensures that any children she has, any offspring she has, whether fathered by black men or white men, will be considered enslaved as well. So it kind of safeguards the system. It gave white men the impunity to continue to rape black women without the fear that the resulting children would automatically be considered free. So as the system is being built, included within the framework are provisions to cover white men who would rape black women, but it works to their benefit, where you're raping with impunity, with no concern or regard for getting in trouble or having to face any kind of consequences. But as it's explained within the documentary, it's an unfortunate term, but really explains the situation, right? The breeding of black women, where black women would be compelled to become pregnant and to produce more offspring. There's actually a potential benefit for enslavers. There's no immediate plan to abolish slavery. So there's still this continued need for slaves. But with banning the importation of Africans, you now have a need to kind of fill that gap. And so this is where it comes into play, this thing of breeding domestically, right? Having black women who are here already reproduce to replenish the slave population, to grow the slave population. And so instead of having to fund these sea voyages from the Americas or from Europe to Africa to bring enslaved Africans, you cut out the risks with that by domestically producing slaves. And having it put across in that way, it reminded me of other things I've learned from history, where so often history is sanitized in a way that it really divorces humanity from history, which is unfortunate because you think about it, history is really the telling of the past and present of people, right? Any given group of people. And here it is that you have such a sanitized and dehumanized telling of history that it removes the humanity of the people at the core of the story. And I remember going to school, being in like elementary school, even like junior high, having textbooks where you're in school maybe 9 months out of the year or something like that. You're in an American history class. You might have world history. And if the textbook included a paragraph or even a chapter, and this is within a textbook of hundreds of pages, if it had even just a paragraph or a chapter about slavery, enslavement within the Americas or colonization within Africa and whatnot, that was a lot. It's like at most you would get maybe a sentence, maybe a paragraph. And even within that, the mental acrobatics to get around calling this thing what it was. But in the years since, through my own independent education, through like reading books, watching documentaries, taking it upon myself to visit different places, you end up with a far different, a more nuanced and detailed perspective. Diving into like facts and figures and whatnot, you realize that the history that's told and taught is so simplified and whitewashed that it loses a lot of nuance, a lot of meaning. I like these kinds of documentaries that, number one, dive more deeply into things and really take this sanitized version of history that's so often told and picks it apart, breaks down what's referred to as like hidden history or reveals hidden history, about America, about other parts of the world. It's like you go to these places, you walk down the street, and there's concrete. There's the world as we see it now in its current physical form. And so it's different from what it might have looked like 100 or 200 years ago. But the history is still there. It might have been paved over, but it's still there. It's just that you kind of need a little bit of direction and guidance to be pointed, to be able to see. And so with that, I love these kind of documentaries where they visit places that if you were just to walk through, you might not know its historical significance. There's such a glossing over, a simplification of things that you miss out on a lot of the details about these people, right? One of the things in the years since living in Atlanta and even going back to New York, walking down the street in certain places, I've taken advantage while living in Atlanta to visit some other nearby cities that played a role in Black history, especially during the Civil Rights Movement. So I visited like Memphis, New Orleans, Nashville, Montgomery, and Birmingham and whatnot, where through history textbooks, movies, documentaries, books, and whatnot, you learn about events that have taken place in these places. But walking down the streets, never mind that time has changed, neighborhoods have changed. It might no longer be like dirt road and open spaces. Places are paved over, places have been developed. So there's like a lot of concrete in place. But yet still, you walk down some of these streets, you might have historic markers, but at the same time, even without that, you go to certain places and you don't realize how often you're walking through what seems like just a regular community fair or something like that. But it's a place where they held slave auctions. I remember going to like New Orleans and just a little bit beyond the French Quarter, like on the edge of the French Quarter, you come to this wide boulevard and it's easy to overlook, but there are like markers that indicate where the slave pens were, where people would be held as livestock in preparation for auction. You walk down the streets and you just see houses there. It looks like a regular street now with houses and trees and whatnot. The place has been transformed. But in this very place, in this very spot, 150 or however many years ago, you would walk through and people would be held there for sale. And it's like nowadays you walk through and unless you're looking for it, you wouldn't be aware. It's like I remember going to Memphis where you drive along the waterfront and I can't remember the name of the street, but you turn, it's like a right turn off the waterfront. Well, depending on what direction you're coming from. And there are like all of these signs directing you to different attractions. And there's a historical marker that speaks about Nathaniel Bedford Forrest. And the marker describes him as being like a very successful entrepreneur in Memphis. That he was from some other part of Tennessee. Walking through, seeing this marker, not diving in any more deeply, you would just think, this was just some random entrepreneurial guy. But the marker is on the spot where he owned property. And diving more deeply into the history, which is something that Robinson does here, he explains who Nathaniel Bedford Forrest really was, where you have this glossing over of history, where this man is portrayed as being an entrepreneur, but it doesn't tell you the business that he was in, right? Which is that he was a slave trader. The spot that marker marks was the location of a slave pen. If he was in the trade, built his business buying and selling people, he was a slave trader. But instead, They just tell you that he was a businessman. Not, that, and it's like, that's bad enough on its own, but they also refer to him as having been, having served within the Confederacy. But they don't tell you that he was also a founding member, a high-ranking member within the Ku Klux Klan. And so it's like, that's just one of the examples of this thing of history being out in the open, but at the same time glossed over, right? Where every day we pass by these historical spots, but not knowing, it's so easy to not be aware. It's like when you go to Montgomery in Alabama. I visited when the Legacy Museum opened, as well as the Memorial to Lynching. There's like maybe a 10-15 minute walk between the two. So shorter distance if you drive, less time if you drive. But it's like near the Legacy Museum, if you walk down towards the waterfront, there's like a little boat landing there, as well as like some railroad tracks and whatnot, remnants of a railroad station. And it looks like a nice little spot to sit, maybe have lunch or something like that. Very scenic place. But without knowing any better, you might think, this was like a ferry landing, a boat landing, or something like that. In the other direction from the museum, there's like a little square there, but in digging deeper, you realize that the area by the water, that's where they would bring like slaves into town on boats, as well as via the railroad station. The little square in the other direction, the little patch of grass with the marker there that looks like it's not much of anything, that was actually like an auction block, and so it's like when you visit the Legacy Museum, it's actually pretty eye-opening that when you first walk into the entrance, just right near the entrance, there's a little map there that, obviously you can walk through the area in the present, and there are like different buildings and businesses and things like that, parking garages and modern buildings, amenities and facilities. But there's a map right near the entrance at the Legacy Museum of what the city looked like in the past. Specifically this area. And it shows you these buildings that you might not pay attention to, some of these facilities and features that you might not pay attention to because of their current form, right? That many of these nearby buildings that you would walk past and not give a second look, that they house businesses that were involved in the slave trade. It's like if you head down towards the water and the train station, that's where enslaved people were brought into and taken out of the city. Transported in and out of the city. If you go in the next direction to the corner, you see like a little square, that was the auction block. Head down the street, there are various buildings along the way that house insurers, brokers, and other people who help to finance and insure the various aspects of the slave trade. And so it's like this thing of history being hidden in plain sight. And so I love documentaries like this that dive into this kind of stuff. Even through like law, dissecting aspects of the Constitution, dissecting aspects of the amendments, various laws and statutes that help to establish this system of white supremacy, the history of various places and locations, peoples and things, the true telling of their history rather than this sanitized and glossed over version. It really puts things in perspective. And it's like coupled with being able to visit some of these places is really cool. It makes history all the more real. It helps to humanize things, and it gives you a more precise perspective on history, where it's like there's often this glossing over and retelling of things that robs history of its reality. It changes how we view and interpret things. This glossing over to make things more palatable, right? It changes how we view things. And so this is how we end up with this nonsense of people who say, black people benefited from slavery, that like black people benefited from slavery, or, basically slavery wasn't that bad. These different rationalizations for slavery, downplaying the horrors of the system, the experiences that people certainly had. Number one, the reality that human beings had to endure this for generations, downplaying the horror of the institution. That's the first thing. But it then creates a pathway for you to downplay the continued effects of the system. Where in the present they're trying to do away with like Black history in schools, promoting this ridiculous idea that people benefited under slavery, that enslaved people were treated as family, various documentary books and whatnot. If we allow people to continue with this sanitized, manipulative telling of history, it changes history. Because as time goes on and you have this constant retelling, this constant reframing of history that becomes the story that's handed down, you start to lose the reality of just how terrible this institution was, as well as the continued ramifications, how terrible Jim Crow and segregation was, because you have this constant downplaying of these systems. And so because it does that, this documentary is amazing. I don't want to dive like too deeply into things because we'll be here forever, but just know that it's definitely worth checking out. And so it's like, there's a scene early on where Robinson is walking down the street and he comes across these three men gathered in front of a Confederate statue, right? Holding the Confederate flag. And I loved that he started a dialogue with them. And this is something that you see with politicians where they quite often manipulate history, right? Sound bites and whatnot that people don't really push back on. And it's refreshing to see him stand there and speak to these men and just pick apart their arguments and point out how ridiculous the things they're saying are. The things that they were saying were outright lies, manipulations, retellings of the truth. And I love it where you have just completely based on logic rather than emotion, you have him just dismissing the nonsense. You have some of these politicians out here or some of these other public figures where it's like, when it suits whatever agenda that they're trying to push, when they're telling just complete nonsense, you need more people. You need more books and commentary like this, more documentaries like this to be put out there to debunk a lot of this misinformation that people are trying to push. And so with that, I think this is just an amazing documentary. To see him just completely pick apart and obliterate all this nonsense out here was very refreshing. And so with that, I highly recommend Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website by the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.